The packet had been sitting in the queue for 6 months, 4 days. And when I opened it at 3:40 station time in the Compact's Displacement Bureau, approximately 11 hours. It was labeled in the Compact's tidy classification system, case file D7741NM, non-member distress intake, origin, LUNVAATH convoy designation 7. Below that in the filing notes added by the 3 separate agency desks that had touched it before routing it to the dead letter partition. No member jurisdiction, no treaty obligation, no forwarding recommended, closed pending re-inquiry. Each note was stamped by a different species consular office. Each stamp was dated approximately 6 weeks after the last, the way a problem gets passed politely, until enough time has passed that the problem can be declared expired. The note on the second desk stamp read in full, forwarded to Vethmon Consulate per standard non-member intake protocol. Vethmon Consulate response, species not recognized under existing treaty framework, no member world obligation to respond. Recommend reroute to Compact Central Intake for general processing. The Compact Central Intake note on the third stamp read, no member jurisdiction established, no Article 7 obligation applicable. No species advocate on file. Closed to dead letter partition pending re-inquiry with member advocate, if identified. No member advocate had been identified. No one had looked for one. The file had sat in the dead letter partition for 4 months after the third stamp, accumulating a timestamp that grew further from the original date of transmission with every cycle of the station's clock. I had been retired for 3 months when they called me back to process the backlog, not because I was the best choice, because the Compact's Displacement Bureau had accumulated 1,142 cases of this type in 18 months, and most of the people who knew the intake system well enough to close them cleanly had, like me, reached their limit and gone home. The Compact's Human Liaison section had 3 staff members left. I was the 4th they'd recalled. The other 3 had been there 4 months already, and the backlog had grown, not shrunk. My title was Rear Admiral, retired. My actual function in those first weeks back was closer to file clerk. I reviewed distress packets, checked jurisdictional flags, forwarded what could be forwarded, and stamped administratively closed on the ones that couldn't. It was not heroic work. It was the necessary underside of how a galactic body processes the suffering it has collectively decided is not its problem. The Bureau's night shift ran with 4 people. Dayside had 12. We had a lunch room with a broken heating element that no one had fixed in 8 months, and a window that looked out onto an interior maintenance corridor, which at least had the virtue of never going dark. I am telling you about the Lunvoth packet because it was not the worst case in the queue. It was not even in the top 50, by the numbers. 1,142 cases means 1,142 distress signals from somewhere, each one representing some species or faction or civilian population that had been assessed by the intake system and found to fall outside the Compact's obligation to respond. Most of them were genuinely hopeless by the time I reached them. The dates alone told me. A convoy that had launched with 9 months of reserves, adrift for 2 years, nothing to do but log it and close it. A colony ship whose last position beacon had gone cold 16 months after the distress filing closed. A refugee flotilla that had been adrift in a system with no relay access, whose signal had taken 8 months to reach a relay, who had launched with 4 months of fuel. Mathematics did the work, not me. I had learned in my first weeks back to run the calculation before I read the file content. There was less cost to the arithmetic if you knew the answer before you read the names. Case D4499 had been a population of nearly 12,000. Case D5512 had been a smaller group, a religious convoy of a few hundred, one of those communities that move together through space as a matter of doctrine, who had been displaced from a system when an industrial extraction operation began, and who had nowhere specific to go. Case D5512 had filed its distress signal 14 months before I reached it in the queue. The signal had been strong and well organized, and had included a detailed population manifest and a formal request for interim sanctuary under any compact member world framework that would take them. The signal had been filed and stamped and passed along precisely as the system intended, and the system had done precisely what it was designed to do, which was to identify the absence of treaty obligation and route accordingly, and somewhere in the chain of identifications and routings the margin had closed. I closed those cases by running the arithmetic and logging the closure. I did not read the names in the manifests after the first week. That had been advice from one of the 3 staff members who had been there before me, a woman named Specialist Oren T, who had been doing the work for 4 months, and who had arrived at the lunch room one day with something in her face that I recognized, and who had said to me, without preamble, "Don't read the manifests unless the math gives you a reason to. You can't carry all of them." It was good advice. I tried to follow it. But case D7741NM was different, and I recognized the difference the moment I ran the calculation. The Luftwaffe Convoy 7 had filed its distress packet 211 days ago. I looked up the species. The Luftwaffe are not widely catalogued. They are not compact members, have no permanent embassy, and their homeworld, a gas giant atmosphere layer in the outer reach of the Sen-Helot system, had been rendered uninhabitable by a cascade failure in the atmospheric processing infrastructure their civilization had been building for 60 years. They are soft-bodied and pelagic in their natural environment, designed by evolution for buoyancy and drift in warm atmospheric columns, not for deep space transit. But they had built transit ships, the way any species builds what it needs to survive, and they had launched 7 convoys before their infrastructure failed completely. 6 of the 7 convoys had reached member world systems and been received with varying degrees of reluctance. 1 had been taken informally, 2 had been given temporary humanitarian berths, 3 had been in a state of ongoing negotiation for member world settlement rights when I opened D7741's file. Convoy 7 had launched last, just barely, and had been routed into the call, an interstitial drift lane between relay stations, dark and slow, used mostly by low-priority freight, because all the faster corridors had been classified as congested by member species shipping authorities who had not wanted a convoy of unknown biological status in their lanes. The call was not dangerous, exactly. It was simply very far from anywhere that paid attention to it. There were no relay stations in the call. Messages out of the call traveled at whatever speed the sending vessel's own communications array could manage, which for a convoy of Luftwaffe civilian transports running on reduced power was not fast. The distress packet had taken 4 months to reach the nearest relay station. It had then spent 2 months in the intake queue before being routed to a desk, which had spent 6 weeks assessing it and forwarding it to a second desk, which had spent 6 weeks forwarding it to the dead letter partition where I found it. The convoy had launched with 9 months of reserves. 211 days is just under 7 months. If the convoy was still alive, it had somewhere between 6 and 9 weeks of reserves remaining, possibly less if they had been running systems conservatively, possibly more if they had cut life support to minimum. The margin was not comfortable, but it existed. This was not a mathematical certainty of death I was looking at. It was a mathematical possibility of rescue. I ran the calculation 3 times because I wanted to be sure I was not making an error in my own favor. Then I sat at the bureau desk at 3:40 station time, in an office that smelled of recycled air and old filtration media, and the particular quiet of an administrative building running a skeleton night shift, and I thought about what I was going to do next. There is a thing that happens to people who work in systems like the Compact's Displacement Bureau for long enough. The system teaches you, slowly and without malice, to perform a specific kind of arithmetic. On one side of the arithmetic, the action required, the resources needed, the authorization process, the jurisdictional questions, the treaty obligations invoked or not invoked, the political cost of acting. On the other side, the number of lives at stake and the probability of saving them. The system does not teach you to weight those two sides equally. It teaches you to weight the first side more heavily because the first side is what gets reviewed, what gets logged, what appears in the after-action report and the tribunal proceeding and the political briefing. The second side is what you carry home. I had been doing this arithmetic for 26 years. I had gotten very good at it. I had stamped 43 cases administratively closed in the past 3 weeks, 43 signals from somewhere, 43 populations that had reached the end of the queue and found nothing waiting. I had not read the manifests for 37 of them. I had read the manifests for 6 in my first week, before Specialist T gave me the advice. 6 was more than enough to carry. I had not added to that number since. I closed the case file window, then I opened it again. What I was looking at was this: a species I had never encountered, in a drift lane 6 weeks transit from the nearest station, with somewhere between 6 and 9 weeks left to live if the math was favorable and less if it wasn't. And a distress packet that 3 separate desks had decided was not their problem on the grounds that the Luftwaffe had no member status, no treaty protections, and no species willing to file a formal intake on their behalf. The compact system did not provide for rescuing people who had no one to rescue them. It provided for processing distress signals from member species and forwarding signals from non-members to member world consulates for consideration, and the consulates had considered it and forwarded it to the dead letter partition. That was the process. The process had worked exactly as designed. The Luftwaffe had no member status. They had no consulate. They had no species filing on their behalf because the species that might have done so had each separately determined that it was not their treaty obligation. I was a retired rear admiral doing file clerk work in a dead letter queue at 3:40 station time, and I had approximately 1,140 cases behind this one that also needed to be processed. I read the filing officer's name at the bottom of the original distress packet. It was the only named field in the document. Everything else was coded by convoy designation and species classification number. The filing officer had included her name because the filing protocol had a field for it, and she had filled it in, the way you fill in the fields that are there. I closed the file. Then I opened the requisition system. I want to be clear about what I did and did not know at that moment. I did not know whether the Luftwaffe convoy was still alive. The last beacon pulse logged in their packet was 211 days old. Anything could have happened in 211 days. They could have been taken in by a passing freight convoy. They could have made contact with one of the 6 convoys that had already reached member worlds and been directed somewhere. They could have found a way out of the call on their own. Or they could be dead, in which case I was about to commit a significant number of unauthorized resource expenditures in the direction of a cold and empty drift lane for nothing. I also did not know what the Luftwaffe were like, beyond the species catalog entry, which was sparse, pelagic, atmospheric, soft-bodied, bioluminescent. The entry noted they produced living light as a biological function, the way some deep ocean species on Earth do, the light generated by organisms in their tissue layers rather than by any external source. The entry included a single image, taken by a compact survey team 40 years ago when the Luftwaffe had first been catalogued. A group of them in their atmospheric habitat, drifting in a warm column of gas, their bodies faintly lit from within in gradients of amber and pale blue. They looked in the image like something dreamed rather than evolved, like the idea of a living thing translated into light and given slow motion. I sat with the image for a moment, then I filed the requisition. The requisition for HDCV reasoned argument and 3 civilian transports went in at 4:12. The medical support request for the hospital ship Meridian Line went in at 4:18. At 4:31, before any of those requests had been reviewed or approved by anyone, I opened a second system I had not used in 11 years, the Compact's Refugee Status Filing Interface. and I filed a formal petition for protected asylum status on behalf of Luftwaffe Convoy 7. The petition had to be filed by a member species or a member species authorized representative. I was a human officer, technically on recall status with the Compact's Human Liaison Section, which made me an authorized representative of Earth in an administrative capacity. I filed under that authority. The petition named Earth as the guarantor species of record. It requested formal Compact recognition of the Luftwaffe convoy's refugee status under the Compact's Displacement Charter, Article 9, Subsection 4, the subsection that applied to non-member species facing extinction-level displacement events, and it requested that, pending the outcome of that petition, the convoy be considered under Provisional Compact protection. I had never filed a petition under Article 9, Subsection 4. I was not entirely certain anyone had. The subsection existed because someone, at some point in the drafting of the Displacement Charter, had thought to include it, but a species that had no member world advocates had no pathway to invoke it, because invoking it required a filing species. Earth had never been asked to be a filing species for anyone. I was not asking Earth. I was acting as Earth's representative on recall, at 4:31 station time, in an empty office in the Compact's Displacement Bureau, and I was filing on Earth's behalf without asking. I wrote the filing note with care, in language that would survive a tribunal review, and I made sure the filing note read, at its close, in plain terms. The filing officer recognizes that this action is without prior authorization. The filing officer accepts all procedural liability. The filing officer notes that the margin in this case is between 6 and 9 weeks, that the review process for unauthorized requisitions takes between 3 and 5 weeks, and that these two timelines are mutually exclusive. This was procedurally irregular. I logged my reasoning in the case file in detail and submitted everything simultaneously so that the review desk would receive the requisitions and the asylum petition at the same time and understand that one was in support of the other. Then I closed my terminal, turned off the desk light, and went to find my crew. Specialist T was in the lunch room when I came through at 4:45. She was eating something and reading a brief, and she looked up at me with the expression of someone who has been awake for a long time and is comfortable with it. I told her what I had filed and where I was going. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "You don't know they're alive." "No," I said, "but I know the margin is there if they are." She looked at me for another moment. Then she said, "The queue is 1,142 cases." 41 now, I said. She put down her brief. "I'll cover your desk while you're gone." I said, "T, I'm not authorized. This could come back badly." She said, "I know, go." That was the last thing she said to me before I left the bureau. I have thought about it many times since. She stayed at her desk and processed the queue for 33 more days while I was in the call, and she did it without asking whether I was going to come back or whether the tribunal was going to find against me. She just covered my desk. There is a specific kind of professional solidarity that does not announce itself, that does not require acknowledgement, and that is in every practical sense indistinguishable from courage. T had it. She had been doing it for 4 months before I arrived, and she kept doing it after I left. The reasoned argument was a compact humanitarian coordination vessel, not a warship, not a rescue ship in the dedicated sense, but the kind of vessel built to coordinate exactly this sort of operation from a mobile platform. It carried medical liaison staff, communications arrays capable of reaching into drift lanes with minimal relay support, and enough internal volume to function as a staging area for larger rescue operations. I had served on one for 4 years early in my career. I knew the class well. The crew I assembled over the next 6 hours was not a crew in any official sense. It was 6 people who, when I explained the situation and the timeline, decided that they wanted to help. My communications officer was a lieutenant named Hadil Os, who had been assigned to the bureau on a rotation she hated, and who, when I told her what I was doing, said, "When do we leave?" before I had finished explaining the legal exposure. She was 29 years old and had spent 2 years staffing relay maintenance logistics for the Bureau's communications section and had applied for field assignment 4 times without success. She brought herself, her kit, and a personal communications rig she had built in her bunk on the station that she said could hear further into a drift lane than the reasoned argument's standard array. I did not ask whether she had cleared it with the communications section. She did not tell me. My medical liaison was a civilian contractor named Dr. Prosper Adekanal, who had been staffing a transit clinic on the station for 2 years and who, when I told him, we might be receiving several thousand soft-bodied pelagic beings in atmospheric distress, and I did not have a detailed medical protocol for them, said he would figure it out on the way. He was matter-of-fact about it in the way that good physicians are matter-of-fact about impossible problems, not dismissively, but with the specific confidence of someone who has had to build a protocol under pressure before and trusts their ability to do it again. He packed 3 cases of general atmospheric supplement and a diagnostic kit that was designed for carbon-based physiology broadly construed, and said he would make it work. The other 4 were volunteers from the station's administrative pool, 2 logistics clerks, an environmental systems tech named Burrock who had been on the station for 6 years and who said, when I asked him to come, that he had been waiting for something like this to happen, and a comms rating on his second posting, who had heard through the Bureau's internal channel that something was going on, and had arrived at the reasoned arguments dock before I did, carrying his kit and wearing the particular expression of a young man who has made a decision he cannot fully explain but does not regret. We departed at 15:47 without formal authorization. The Compact's Displacement Bureau review desk had flagged my requisition as procedurally irregular and opened a review process that would take, by their standard timeline, between 3 and 5 weeks to resolve. I was not going to wait 3 to 5 weeks. I left a copy of all my documentation with the Bureau's duty officer, a Vethmon administrator named Kelsohn, who read it carefully, twice, and then said, very precisely, that she was going to forward it up the chain with her own note of record, and that she suggested I not make any sublight commits that were irreversible for the first several hours, in case the review came back faster than expected. I thanked her. I made the sublight commit at 15:50. Kelsohn, I later learned, had attached a personal note to the forwarded documentation that read, in translation from the Vethmon Administrative Formal Register, "This filing officer has identified a viable margin in a case the Bureau's standard process allowed to expire. This clerk considers that the filing officer's actions represent a use of discretion consistent with the humanitarian mandate of the Bureau's founding charter, and recommends that the review panel take account of this consistency when determining the appropriate procedural response." She had no obligation to write that note. She wrote it anyway. I did not know about it until the tribunal, when the panel chair read it into the record. The transit to the call's entry point took 11 days. The call itself, at the traverse speed the reasoned argument and 3 civilian transports could manage together, would take another 22 days to cross to the sector where the Luftwaffe convoy's last logged position had been. We had 33 days of transit ahead of us, and I did not know whether we would find anyone alive at the end of them. Hadil kept the communications array running the entire way, hers and the ship's standard rig both, sending ahead on the frequencies the Luftwaffe distress packet had listed as the convoy's active broadcast range. We did not expect a response. The call's geometry, 8 signals the way a long corridor eats light, folding them into the background noise of the drift lane's ambient radiation until they were indistinguishable from static. But the sending was its own kind of act. It felt important not to be silent while we traveled toward them. Hadil kept a log of every transmission, with timestamps and frequency ranges, and she posted the log to the shared board on the reasoned argument's internal network so that everyone on the ship could see that we were calling and that we had not stopped calling. On day 6 of the call traverse, we received a message from the Compact's review desk. The requisition had been flagged for escalation due to the simultaneous Asylum petition, which had prompted a procedural inquiry into whether an officer on recall had the authority to file under Article 9, subsection 4. The message did not order me to return. It requested my presence at a formal review session to be scheduled at my earliest convenience. I logged a response noting that my earliest convenience was currently limited by active transit in a low relay zone, and that I would attend the review at the earliest opportunity following my current operational commitment. I did not specify what that operational commitment was. The response came back 4 days later. The review was being expedited. The Asylum petition had attracted the attention of 3 member species consulates who were filing objections on grounds of procedural irregularity, the same grounds on which those 3 consulates had previously stamped the Lunvoth packet non-actionable, a coincidence that was noted in the review record and not commented upon by the panel. The Compact's Human Liaison Office formally disavowed my filing authority pending the review. I was informed that any actions taken in anticipation of an asylum grant that had not yet been confirmed were undertaken at my personal risk. I logged the message and kept going. Dr. Adekanal spent most of the transit working through the Lunvoth biological catalog with the hospital ship's medical team via relay. The Meridian Line's chief physician was a Trell, a member species, herbivorous and meticulous, named Senior Practitioner Vaccine, who had never worked with soft-bodied pelagic beings, but who had, apparently, an extraordinary depth of knowledge about atmospheric-dwelling species and the specific ways that pressurized spacecraft created physiological stress for them over extended periods. She had spent 20 years treating displacement cases across the Compact's intake network, and she told Adekanal on the 3rd relay exchange, seen enough cases of prolonged atmospheric environment deprivation to have built a general framework, even if she had never worked with bioluminescent tissue physiology specifically. She and Adekanal spent 12 days building a protocol together, across the relay lag, with the help of what fragments the Lunvoth catalog contained, and a great deal of inference from analogous species. I could hear them working through the walls of the reasoned argument at night, their voices, his a warm baritone with a Lagos rhythm to it, hers the precise flat Trell register that carries its own kind of warmth once you learn to read it, running through variables I didn't understand and arriving at conclusions I couldn't evaluate. I trusted them. That is what you do with people who are doing the work they are best at. You get out of the way and you trust them, and you make sure the ship stays on course. Buruk, the environmental systems tech, spent the transit running heat efficiency calculations for the transport's receiving bays. The Lunvoth biological profile indicated a preference for warm atmospheric environments significantly above standard human comfort range. Buruk built a thermal management plan for each transport that would run their receiving areas at the Lunvoth optimal range without overwhelming the ship's climate systems, and he ran it past Adekanal for biological review, and the 2 of them revised it twice before they were satisfied. He did this without being asked. He simply identified the problem and solved it, and then he told me what he had done, and I said, "Good." That was the full extent of our management relationship on that ship, and it was correct. Hadl kept the array pointed ahead. On day 20 of the call traverse, at 2:47 station time, she came to find me. I was in my cabin, not asleep. I had been awake for most of the past 3 days in the particular state of sleeplessness that is not alertness, but is not rest either, a low, sustained vigilance that feels like it is holding something together that might otherwise come apart. I heard her knock and I said, "Come," and she opened the door and stood in the threshold with the expression I had been watching her face for 20 days without seeing, the one that meant she had something to report. She said, "Admiral, they're there." I did not say anything for a moment. "How many signals?" "7 distinct sources," she said. "All beacon protocol minimum. They're running quiet, but they're there, all 7. 7 ships. The convoy had launched with 7 ships. All 7 were still broadcasting." I did not make a scene of the moment. I got up, put on my uniform, and went to the bridge. But I want you to understand what it meant in the context of that long and silent transit to hear that number. 7. Every ship that had gone into the call was still there. Whatever had happened in 8.5 months of drift, whatever they had run out of, whatever systems they had shut down, whatever decisions had been made in the dark in a language I didn't speak, they had kept all 7 ships running. I thought about the filing officer's name at the bottom of the distress packet, the name I had not read aloud and had not shared with anyone on the ship. I had been carrying it alone for 20 days because some things are private until they are no longer private, and this one wasn't yet. I thought about the catalog image, living light in a warm column of gas. I thought about how cold the call was. We had 2 days of transit remaining to reach their position. Hadil broadcast their frequency for 2 days straight, both rigs, all bands. No response. The signals were all minimum beacon. The ships either lacked the power to respond or had made the decision that responding cost more than it was worth. Both possibilities told me things about their condition that I did not like. Minimum beacon is the last automated signal a ship sends when it has stopped sending everything else. It is the heartbeat you maintain when you have nothing left to say. On the evening of day 22, the forward visual array picked them up. 7 shapes in the call's ambient amber light, Sen Helat, the distant star of their lost homeworld, was just visible as a point of warmth on the far edge of the call's approach corridor, enough to catch the hulls in profile without illuminating anything clearly. I brought up the magnification, and I looked at them for a long time. The Lunvath ships were a design I had never seen before, built for atmosphere-to-transit conversion, with broad lower hulls that would have been designed to ride atmospheric columns in their homeworld's upper layers and narrower upper structures built for the pressures of transit. They were not small ships. They were built for populations, not for crew. And they were entirely dark. No running lights, no viewport illumination, no engine glow. 7 large shapes in the call, holding together in the cold drift formation pattern. The catalog said the Lunvath used to conserve heat by proximity, close enough that the ship's residual heat could share across the gap between them, like animals huddled against a winter they had not been built for. Nothing on the outside told you they were alive. The beacon signals, faint as they were the only evidence. I watched the array for a full minute and I did not see movement, did not see light, did not see anything that looked like a response to our approach. I thought about the catalog's design notes for the Lunvath transit class. The broad lower hulls engineered to ride atmospheric pressure gradients, now adapted to the geometry of vacuum, holding heat by proximity the way those hulls had once held altitude by mass. They had been built for a warm and living sky. They were in a cold and silent lane. They had managed the difference for 8.5 months, and the managing showed in every dark viewport and every cold hull surface, and it was not a mark against them. It was the specific dignity of people who had survived something that should have killed them and had not stopped surviving. I brought the reasoned argument to rest at 2,000 meters from the convoy's leading ship, and told Hadil to broadcast on all their frequencies, voice and signal both. Nothing came back. I put the transport vessels into position, one at each of the 4 largest convoy ships and one covering the cluster's periphery, and I told each transport captain to run their exterior floodlights to full, not the standard running lights. The floods, the broad-spectrum external illumination arrays that the transports carried for dock operations, and that would, at our current distance, light the convoy's outer hull surfaces clearly. The reason I did it was simple. They had been dark for 11 days. I did not know that yet. I would not know the exact number until we had boarded and could read their internal logs, but I knew from the minimum beacon status that they had been running power conservation for an extended period, and I knew from the thermal readings that their ships were significantly colder than standard civilian vessel operating temperature. They were in the dark and they were cold, and the first thing I could do that cost me nothing was make sure that there was light and warmth coming from outside, visible to anyone who was able to look. The transport's floodlights came on simultaneously, on my mark. I watched the convoy on the visual array. The amber-lit silhouettes sharpened into lit surfaces, hull panels, viewport clusters, the broad lower hulls that had been designed for atmosphere. I could see the geometry of the drift formation clearly now, the ships angled toward each other in the specific arrangement the catalog had described. For 37 seconds, nothing changed. Then, on the leading ship of the convoy, a single light appeared in a viewport. It was amber, very faint. It did not look like ship lighting. It did not have the flat color temperature of an LED panel or the specific warmth of an incandescent source. It had the quality of something biological, uneven, slightly gradient, warm at its center and cooler at its edge, the way the catalog image had shown it. The bioluminescence, the living light that the Luftwaffe generated in their own tissue, involuntarily, the way a body responds to warmth after a long cold. The first light brightened slowly. Then a second viewport on the same ship lit, and a third. The lights in each viewport were not uniform. They varied slightly in color and intensity, because they were not all from the same body, but from multiple beings who had been dark and were now, together in the same space, beginning to wake. It moved through the convoy ship by ship, not all at once, not in a coordinated sequence, but the way warmth spreads when it is given rather than commanded ship by ship at its own pace in its own time. The leading ship, then the nearest neighbor after a pause of nearly a minute, then the one behind that faster. Then the three at the convoy's periphery at different intervals, each ship waking in the rhythm of its own population, its own particular collection of people who had been conserving themselves in the dark and were now deciding, or simply finding, that they did not need to do that anymore. And the seventh ship, the smallest, the one furthest from the cluster's center, a long pause after the sixth, 40 seconds or more, and then a faint amber point in a single viewport, just one, just barely, and then nothing more for a full minute, and then two more viewports. And then slowly, over the course of the next 20 minutes as we maintained our position and our flood stayed on, the seventh ship coming to light in its own time. Hadil made a sound beside me that I did not acknowledge because I would not have been able to speak clearly if I had. I heard it, and I recorded it in the part of myself that keeps records separate from the official ones, and I have not forgotten it. "Begin boarding approach," I said. My voice was level. After 26 years, you learn to make your voice level when it matters. The boarding began at 6:14. The Luftwaffe leading ship's docking collar accepted our connection on the first attempt. They had heard us coming, whatever their power situation, and someone had made sure the collar was available and operable. What came through the collar first was not a delegation or a commanding officer. It was a child. She was small even by the standards of the species, her body the length of my forearm, drifting in the microgravity of the access tube with the deliberate control of someone who had been living in microgravity for months and had learned its economy. Her bioluminescent organs were barely lit, not dark the way they had been before our floods came on, but dim. The dim of something that has been giving light for a long time on reduced fuel and has not yet fully recovered. She was amber at her core and nearly pale at her edges, and she moved in the access tube with a careful drift that might have been caution, or might have been the physical reality of a body that had been cold for a long time. She looked at a decanal, who was first through the collar because we had agreed that medical personnel should lead the boarding, and she said something in Luftwaffe that the translation system rendered approximately as, "We thought you were freight." A decanal looked at her for a moment. He had the particular stillness of a physician in the presence of a patient, not stillness as distance, but stillness as the choice to not fill the space with anything that wasn't necessary, to give the person in front of you room to be exactly what they are. He said, "No, we're a hospital ship and 3 transports. We have food, medical personnel, and atmospheric supplement. We came from the Bureau." The child processed this. The light in her chest shifted a small thing, barely perceptible, but the translation team later confirmed it was a register shift, not just a reflex. She said, "You filed for us." He said, "Yes, Admiral Solis filed for you. We filed for you 6 weeks ago and we've been in transit since." The child was quiet for a long moment. Her bioluminescence shifted in the chest and upper body region, deepening fractionally. Not a display, not the full luminous cascade the catalog described for strong emotional states, but a perceptible change, the kind that happens when something has been cold for a long time and finds itself, without entirely expecting it, in the presence of warmth. She said, "Will they let you keep us?" A decanal looked back over his shoulder at me. I was standing at the collar access and I saw his face, and I knew what he was asking me to say. I said, "I filed under Article 9, we'll make the case." She looked at me. Her visual organs were distributed in a ring around her upper body, giving her full peripheral vision, but there was an orientation she made with her whole body that functioned the way eye contact functions, a direction of attention that was unmistakable. She held that orientation for a moment. Then she said, "In the translation rendering that I want to note is approximate. The Luftwaffe use a tonal system that does not map cleanly to declarative syntax, and what I am giving you is the translation team's best reconstruction of a meaning, not a word-for-word parallel. My mother sent the packet. She told me it would find the right desk eventually." She drifted back down the access tube into her ship, and I followed a decanal through the collar, and we began the work. There were 4,612 Luftwaffe across the 7 ships. The original convoy manifest had listed 4,840. That meant 228 had died in the 8.5 months of drift, mostly in the first 2 months, the manifest notes later confirmed, when the power situation had been most acute and the system's management protocols had not yet been fully worked out. 228 deaths in a convoy of civilians who had launched with 9 months of reserves because everything else had already been taken from them, and who had made their reserves last as long as they could, and who had in the end lasted long enough. The remaining 4,612 were alive, depleted, and in varying degrees of physiological distress. The call was colder than the Luftwaffe's atmospheric home by a significant margin, and cold, sustained over months, had done specific things to their bioluminescent tissue. A kind of metabolic suppression that was not damage exactly, but was a deep energy conservation that the tissue engaged when its host body was consistently cold, reducing light production to the minimum required for basic biological signaling. Vassine's protocol addressed this directly with atmospheric warming treatment, and a specific supplement compound she and a decanal had developed in transit that, when introduced to the Luftwaffe atmospheric environment in the transport's receiving bays, would give the bioluminescent tissue the chemical inputs it needed to recover normal function. The recovery was not dramatic. It was gradual, over hours and days, as people moved into the warmer bays and the supplements circulated, and the tissue began to return to its normal production levels. But by the end of the 2nd day aboard the transports, the receiving bays had a quality of ambient light that came from no installed source, a warm amber and pale blue diffusion that came from 4,000 people beginning, at their own pace, to give light again. Buruk told me on the 3rd day that his thermal management calculations had underestimated the heat the Luftwaffe would generate themselves once their bioluminescence recovered. He had built in a buffer, and the buffer was sufficient, but he said it with the expression of someone who had been surprised by something beautiful and was not entirely sure what to do with it. I told him to add it to the design notes for the next time. He looked at me as if the existence of a next time was something he was still getting used to. The convoy's senior officer, the primary keeper of the collective record, in a translation I have already explained is approximate, was a woman named Uth Seal. She met me in the leading ship's command center on the second day, when the most acute medical situations had been stabilized, and there was space for the kind of conversation that wasn't logistics. She was larger than the child who had come through the collar first, her bioluminescence running at a steady controlled amber that the translation team told me was the register for formal address, not cold, but measured, the way a person speaks when what they are saying matters and they want to say it correctly. She moved in the ship's microgravity with the same careful economy the child had shown, and I recognized it now as what it was. The economy of long adaptation, the way a body learns to move when it has been living for months in a space that is smaller and colder and less forgiving than it was built for, and has found a way to be sufficient to those conditions. There was nothing broken about it. It was, in its way, a kind of competence. She said, "You came from Earth." I said, "Yes." "Not from the Compact Bureau." "From the Bureau," I said, "but I am human. Earth's representative technically for filing purposes. The filing was under Earth's authority." She was quiet for a moment. Her bioluminescence shifted slightly, not extinguished, but deepened, the amber becoming richer in a way the translation team had noted was associated with what they rendered as the recognition of weight, the processing of something that has scale. She said, "I knew about Earth. We had the catalog entries. We knew you were a young species, not old in the Compact's terms. We knew you had been in the Compact for less than a generation. We did not know why Earth would file for us." I said, "We have had people in the queue for a long time. We know what it means to send a signal and wait." It was not a complete answer. It was not meant to be. She looked at me, the full body orientation, the visual ring directed toward me, and held the attention for several seconds. She said, "My mother sent the packet." I said, "I know, I read her filing." "She died in the 3rd month," Uth Seal said. "The cold was specific to her biology. There were others with the same susceptibility, and she was among the first. She did not think the signal would be answered. She had been a civil communications officer before the infrastructure failure, and she understood the Compact's intake procedures well enough to know what the timeline was likely to be, and what that timeline meant for us. She sent the packet because she had committed to sending it, and she was not going to stop on the grounds that it would probably not work." I did not say anything for a moment. She said, "What is her name in the record?" I said, "The filing was under Convoy 7's transit designation. She is logged as the primary contact officer. Her name is in the file." I paused. "It is San Uth." Uth Seal's bioluminescence shifted again, not the formal amber, but something paler, cooler, that the translation team had listed with no clean equivalent, and rendered with a notation that said, "The light kept for someone who is no longer keeping their own." I said, "She found the right desk." Uth Seal said, "Yes." We were quiet together for a while. The ship systems hummed around us, and through the command center's forward viewport. Senhelat's amber light came in at an angle that warmed the port side of the space, their lost star, still visible from the call, a long way off. The reasoned argument was visible outside, and the 3 transports, their floodlights still on, their receiving bays now carrying the ambient warmth of 4,000 people who were no longer dark. In the amber light, the Lunvoth ships had taken on a quality I had not expected. The broad atmospheric hulls were reflecting both the external light and the light leaking from the viewports, and the resulting glow was warm and complex, and entirely unlike anything I had ever seen on a ship in a drift lane. I thought, this is what the file was. This is what all the files are. Someone sent a signal from the dark and it sat in a queue, and the queue is very long, and most of the time the signal expires before anyone reaches it. but the signal existed. The mother who sent it, who died in the third month, who had been a civil communications officer who understood the intake timeline and had sent the packet anyway, because she had committed to it and was not going to stop, she had been right. Not right in the sense she might have hoped for. Not answered quickly, not answered by the right agency through the right process, not answered before she died. But right in the way that matters when you have no other options. Right that it was worth sending. Right that someone would eventually run the calculation. Right that the margin might still be there. She had committed to sending it, and she had not stopped. The desk she had found was not the desk she had expected, but it was the one that ran the calculation. On day 41 of the total transit, 11 days after we had found the convoy and begun the transfer process, we received a formal communication from the Compact's Article 9 review panel. The Asylum petition had been expedited, as I had been informed it would be. The review had taken, in the end, 19 days. The communication was addressed to me as the filing party, and its first substantive sentence read, "The panel finds that the filing under Article 9, subsection 4, by Earth's authorized representative, Rear Admiral Marin Solis, is procedurally valid under the emergency provisions of the subsection." Hadil read it over my shoulder. She said, "Procedurally valid." "They're not going to tell me I was right," I said. "They're going to tell me I was valid. It's the same thing in the Compact's language." The petition was upheld, 31-9. The 9 objecting member species had all cited procedural irregularity, and all 9 objections had been noted in the record and overruled on the emergency provisions grounds. Earth was named as guarantor species of record for the Lunvath's resettlement process, the first time in the Compact's history that a non-member species asylum claim had been filed and upheld under a non-member guarantor. The communication noted that this established a precedent, and that the precedent would require further regulatory framework, which would be developed over the following months by a committee on which Earth's liaison section was invited to participate. Hadil said, "We're going to have to staff up." I said, "Yes. The Bureau is going to have a lot more cases now," she said, "if people know there's a mechanism." "That was always the mechanism," I said. "It just hadn't been used." She thought about that, then, "You knew it was there." "I read the charter very carefully on the way out here," I said. "I had 33 days. She laughed, which was the right response, and also the one I needed to hear. The court-martial for unauthorized requisition was scheduled for 3 weeks after our return. I attended it in the same uniform I had worn to the Compact's review panel hearing, because I had not had time to change between appointments, and because there was something appropriate about appearing in front of a military tribunal in a uniform that still carried the particular worn quality of 33 days in transit and 11 days of boarding operations. The charges were read into the record. The defense consisted primarily of the Article 9 review panel's communication, which had found my filing valid and my actions taken in support of a valid filing, and the testimony of senior practitioner Vaccine, who testified that in her medical assessment, the convoy's survival margin at the time of our arrival had been between 6 and 14 days depending on conservative or optimistic modeling, and that the delay introduced by a standard 3 to 5 week review process would have been, with high probability, fatal to the majority of the population aboard. The tribunal also entered into the record Kelsone's note, the one she had attached to the forwarded documentation at 1551, the day I departed, 1 minute after my sublight commit. The panel chair read it aloud. There was a moment of quiet after she read it that was not dramatic, just present, the way a room goes quiet when something has been said that everyone needed to hear but no one expected. The tribunal acquitted me in the same session. The acquittal resolution noted that the panel took no position on the wisdom of the filing officer's decision to proceed without authorization, but found that the outcome of that decision, in conjunction with the Article 9 review panel's subsequent finding of procedural validity, removed the material basis for the original charges. After the session, the tribunal's presiding officer found me in the corridor and said, "They're going to put you back in the bureau." I said, "I know." "They're going to give you more staff," she said. "Not enough," I said. "There are still 1,100 cases in the backlog." She was quiet for a moment. "Will you stay?" I thought about UFCL's bioluminescence. The pale, cool shift with no clean translation. The light kept for someone who is no longer keeping their own. "I'll stay," I said. The Lunvoth resettlement took 14 months. Earth's liaison section ran the coordination, with compact logistical support that improved as the regulatory framework developed, and the precedent hardened into something that other non-member species could invoke. Specialist T took a field assignment. A decanal extended his clinic contract and spent 6 months in the resettlement zone working with Vassine's team on long-term atmospheric adaptation protocols for the Lunvoth's new home. Hadil was promoted and given the communications section she had applied for 4 times without success. Buruk stayed on the Bureau's environmental engineering roster and spent the following year redesigning the receiving bay thermal specifications for the transport class we had used, so that the buffer for bioluminescent heat generation was built into the standard plan. 4,612 Lunvoth were resettled in a gas giant atmospheric layer at the outer edge of a compact member world system, not their original home, not the warm columns of Sen-Helot's upper atmosphere, but a place that could sustain them. The child who had come through the docking collar first, her name translated approximately as "the sound a current makes in still air," was 11 years old at the time of resettlement. I received a message from her 14 months later, relayed through the Bureau. It said approximately, "I told my children about the admiral who found the packet. They asked what packet. I told them, a letter. My grandmother sent a letter and eventually it found the right desk. That is how we are alive." I filed it in the case record. The dead letter Q, when I returned to it after the tribunal, had grown to 1,159 cases. I sat down at the bureau desk in the office with the broken heating element and the window onto the maintenance corridor, and I opened the first one. The arithmetic, after a while, stops being arithmetic. It becomes something closer to a way of reading, learning to look at a case file the way you look at a signal coming in from a long way off, and asking not how long it has been in the queue, but whether there is still, at the end of the transit, someone there to receive you. There usually is. That is the part the queue does not show you. That is the part you have to go and find. I went and found it many more times. Not all of them had a margin. Not all of them came out the way the Lunvoth file came out. Some of them you run the calculation and the calculation tells you the truth, and the truth is that you are too late and there is nothing left to do but close the file correctly and log the number. I learned to do that too. I learned to close those files without reading the manifests, T's original advice, still correct, still necessary, and to move to the next one. The next one was always there. There were always more. But the ones that had a margin, I got faster at finding those. I got better at reading timestamps and relay gaps and the reserve calculations buried in the filing attachments. I built a staff who were also good at it, and we built the kind of institutional knowledge that does not exist until someone decides to build it, one case and one calculation at a time. The queue got shorter. Not empty. It will not be empty in my lifetime. But shorter, by a number I can account for, by the count of the margins we found and used. UFCL sent a second message 4 years later, when the Lunvoth community had stabilized enough for their record-keeping tradition to resume its full form. The translation team spent 3 days with it. What it said, rendered as precisely as they could manage. The Lunvoth keep our records in living light. When a person dies, their light does not go out, it is passed into the record, held by those who continue. My mother's light is in the convoy record. It is in the packet she sent. You held it in your queue for 6 months and then you carried it into the call and you gave it back to us. The compact calls this a precedent. We call it something older. We call it the message arrived. The Lunvath Convention on Resettlement Rights, developed out of the Article 9 precedent, was ratified by the Compact's full assembly 31 months after the convoy's rescue. 17 species that had no member status were covered by its protections within the first year. Earth's liaison section had 12 staff members by the time the convention passed. The queue was always going to be long. Someone made it longer every day by deciding that certain kinds of distress were not their treaty obligation, and someone made it shorter every day by finding the cases that still had a margin and deciding that a margin was worth using. The message arrived. That is all I can tell you in the end that is worth telling. You send the signal from the dark and the queue is long and most desks will stamp it and pass it on. But somewhere in the queue, if the margin still exists, there is a desk where someone is going to run the calculation. And the calculation is going to come out differently. And then they are going to go.